Hello, and thank you for joining us for tonight's USGS public lecture. We are happy you've taken an interest in USGS science. My name is Mitch, and I will be your host and moderator today. I do have some quick announcements to make before I introduce our speaker. First of all, next month's public lecture will be on September 28th at 6 p.m. Pacific time. Oli Caven of the USGS Earthquake Science Center will give his talk, Geothermal Energy Research within the USGS, Goldilocks to Electricity with Earthquakes in Between. If you're watching this from a desktop computer and need to turn on the closed captioning option, please look to the bottom right-hand corner of the screen for the closed caption icon. It should be the one with the two little C's. You can also use stream text for captioning. Please see the stream text link provided in the Q&A window. Another nice feature of this Teams Live platform is you can use the Q&A question and answer panel to submit questions at any point during the lecture. Just look for the question mark icon in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. We encourage you to submit questions all throughout the lecture as you think of them. Then at the end of the lecture, we will try to get all your questions together, but depending on how many come in, we may not have time to ask every one, but we will do our best. And now it's time to introduce you to our speakers. Aparna Bonsai Dodson is the Acting Regional Administrator for the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, one of the 9 regional USGS centers that teams scientists with natural and cultural resource managers and local communities to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. In this role, she undertakes stakeholder and partner engagement to identify science needs, organize the solicitation and review of project proposals in response to those needs, and oversees communications and collaborations with scientists funded by the center. Nicole Herman Mercer is a research social scientist with the Southwest Climate Science Adaptation Science Center. Nicole's research focuses on furthering the understanding of resilience in Indigenous communities through participatory methods. This includes the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge systems and multiple disciplines with the goals of supporting decision-making and adaptation. Cherie Watson is an ecologist at the USGS, working with both the Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center, NORROC, and the Wyoming-Montana Water Science Center. Cherie is working to coordinate and build capacity for USGS in the Mid-Continent region to work with Indigenous communities, including tribal colleges and universities, in water resources and ecosystem management. Without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Aparna. Aparna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Mitch, and thank you everyone for being here today. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules to attend this lecture. Next slide. So today we are just going to cover a few different topics. We're going to try to address them, maybe not totally in depth, but hopefully we give you a flavor of each of them. We're first going to talk a little bit about the effects of climate change on Indigenous communities and how Indigenous communities are adapting to climate change. We're going to go into the benefits of including Indigenous knowledges in USGS science. And then we'll discuss USGS science in service of tribal resource management needs. Next slide. And as was mentioned, there are 3 of us on this lecture today talking about Indigenous communities and climate change. So I'm going to give the overview and then I'm going to pass it to my colleague Nicole, And Nicole's going to talk broadly about inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in USGS science. And then Sherry is going to give a very detailed example of a specific project that really embodies that inclusion of Indigenous knowledge into USGS science. Next slide. So I just wanted to get us all on the same page. I'm going to give a really brief introduction. I think many people are aware, but Indigenous peoples of the Americas are the people who inhabited the Western Hemisphere prior to the arrival of European settlers in the 15th century. And we have a few different designations. There are federally recognized tribes, and that's an American Indian or Alaska Native tribal entity that is recognized as having a government-to-government relationship with the United States. And that comes with responsibilities, powers, limitations, and obligations that come with that designation. Federally recognized tribes have inherent rights of self-government, also called tribal sovereignty, and they are entitled to receive certain federal benefits, services, and protections because of that treaty relationship with the United States. Right now, there are 574 federally recognized tribes, and you can see many of them are on the continental United States, but actually 228 of those federally recognized tribes are located in Alaska alone. So if you see that little panel there off to the side, that is Alaska, and that is a lot of federally recognized tribes. However, there also are other Indigenous communities that exist within the US and its territories, such as state-recognized tribes and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. So those are Indigenous communities, but they do not have the same federal recognition status. Next slide. So I have some photos here from popular news stories and the titles of the news stories. You know, climate change is already impacting natural and cultural resources throughout the US and globally. We see many of these articles coming out in the popular media. This slide is focused on the Arctic, and the Arctic being on the leading edge of these changes. And these titles kind of cover a wide swath of impacts of climate change in the Arctic, from everything to changes in physical climate processes, so changes of snow to rain, changes to ecosystems and landscapes, thinking about, you know, thawing of permafrost, and then impacts to fish and wildlife. So thinking about the impacts to those polar bears that exist in the Arctic. Next slide. However, climate change is no longer just being experienced at the Earth's poles. It's very much now here, affecting each of us every day. In the recent years, we have experienced climate change-driven record-setting fire seasons in Australia, Brazil, and the United States, and of course other parts of the world. And here we're seeing changes to the severity, intensity, and duration of the fire season. And then we also see influences from climate change as to what will occur on the landscape after these fires are over. So we know that climate change is here and now. Next slide. In the modern day, Indigenous communities are leaders in adapting to these impacts of climate change. In some cases, that's due to these deep historical ties to the land and environment of their homelands. And in others, they've experienced geographic displacement caused by settler and colonial policies and had to adapt to dramatically different climates than they had in their ancestral times. This illustration is of an Indigenous holistic worldview, and it visually depicts the interconnected way in which many Indigenous peoples experience the world. It includes factors that influence the natural world from a wide variety of disciplines and viewpoints. Due in part to this interconnected view of the world, Indigenous communities can be particularly vulnerable to the cascading impacts of climate change. And conversely, adaptation strategies grounded in Indigenous knowledges can also build resilience in multiple dimensions. Next slide. So, for example, we know that air temperature is rising, and that can increase drought stress, which can stress native vegetation, and that can leave plants more vulnerable to insect outbreaks, providing greater opportunities for invasive plants to become established. These large-scale, uncharacteristically high-severity wildfires can then contribute to ecosystem conversion, and that can increase with these changing impacts of climate change. Intentional cultural burning is an Indigenous stewardship practice that can enhance ecosystem resilience to climate change and achieve multiple objectives by promoting drought-tolerant and fire-adapted vegetation species, inhibiting insect pests that affect foods such as nuts, seeds, and berries, mitigating large-scale detrimental fires, and promoting the growth of materials that are culturally significant, such as those that are used in basket weaving, that are medicinal, or that are unique food species. So by working with the fire regimes of native and non-native vegetation, cultural burning can also inhibit the establishment of invasive plants. And so this is an example of an Indigenous adaptation or resource management technique that can be used more widely to help systems be more resilient to climate change. Next slide. An example of another traditional practice is the use of clam gardens by coastal Indigenous peoples to support local communities, preserve shellfish populations, and increase the species diversity and ecosystem resilience of coastal areas. Traditional clam gardens concentrate the amount of shell fragments and minerals in the area, making it easier for clams to build shells. This form of Indigenous aquaculture uses sustainable practices to bolster the production of shellfish while also creating an environment that is resilient to the impacts of climate change. Ocean acidification is a threat to clam populations and reduces the ability of shellfish to build their protective shells. But efforts to revive traditional clam gardens support climate resilient food systems for Indigenous peoples and allow for ceremonial subsistence practices to be passed on to future generations. Next slide. So a unique challenge that Indigenous communities are grappling with is the difficult choice of whether or when to leave historical homelands that are threatened by the impacts of climate change. These two photos show aerial views, and on the left is the Ile de Jean-Charles in Louisiana. It's homeland of the Ile de Jean-Charles band of the Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw Indians. And on the right, it is Kivalina, Alaska, which is an Inupiat community. And what this is demonstrating is how projections of sea level rise and coastal inundation are being realized, impacting these communities and forcing them to confront political, ecological, and existential questions about whether they should be attempting to relocate their communities or maybe manage retreat over time. And so these are very, very difficult questions for these communities to deal with. And Indigenous communities are combining their Indigenous knowledges with the findings of Western science to try to address these difficult questions in ways that are inclusive of and sensitive to their worldviews and traditions. So I'm going to turn it over now to Nicole to discuss a little bit about how and why USGS Science is including Indigenous knowledges in our projects.
Okay, thank you so much, Aparna. So my name is Nicole Herman-Mercer, and I want to thank you all for tuning in this evening as well. I'm a research social scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey's Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, and I'm going to talk tonight about elevating and including Indigenous knowledges in USGS science. First, I'll spend some time talking about what Indigenous knowledges are. Then I'll talk a little bit about the recent federal guidance on elevating Indigenous knowledges, and then I'll provide a couple of examples. So to get us all on the same page, I wanted to just provide a description of Indigenous knowledges. And first, I wanted to note that I'm using the plural knowledges here. Across this country, as Aparna showed us, and across the globe, there are many Indigenous communities and cultures, and each holds its own Indigenous knowledge. So in order to honor and recognize those differences, it's important to make this plural unless speaking about one culture or one community. And secondly, before reading this, I want to acknowledge that this description, while generally accepted, is not universal, and some communities will have their own terminology and descriptions for their own Indigenous knowledge. So Indigenous knowledge systems contain a body of observations, oral and written knowledge, practices, and beliefs that are applied by Indigenous peoples to phenomena across biological, physical, cultural, and spiritual systems. Indigenous knowledges are developed by Indigenous peoples and have evolved over millennia and continue to evolve and may have more recent origins. Indigenous knowledges include insights based on evidence acquired through direct relationships with the environment, long-term experiences, extensive observations, and lessons and skills that are passed from generation to generation. Indigenous knowledges are developed, held, and stewarded by Indigenous peoples and are often intrinsic with customary or traditional governance structures and decision-making processes. So while Indigenous knowledge systems are a unique way of knowing and interacting with the world, they also share many similarities with other scientific approaches that are embedded in Western knowledge systems. Some of these similarities include a belief in a unified universe, valuing honesty and inquisitiveness, learning through empirical observations in natural settings, pattern recognition, inference, and making predictions. The understandings that are created by Indigenous knowledges and other scientific approaches both include understanding ecosystems, the properties of objects and materials, and cycles and changes in the earth and sky. Some of the differences between these two ways of knowing are related to the holism of Indigenous knowledge systems, where all things are related, as opposed to the part-to-whole approach that scientific approaches and Western knowledge systems take. The skepticism valued by scientific approaches and Western worldviews is in contrast to the trust for inherited wisdom in Indigenous knowledges. And maybe one of the most important differences is that Indigenous knowledge systems often include moral teachings and spirituality in their understanding of the world, while other scientific approaches explicitly remove morality and spirituality from their scientific pursuits. So on November 15th, 2021, President Biden issued a memo committing to elevate Indigenous knowledges in federal policy decisions. Among other things, this memo established an interagency working group on Indigenous knowledges to develop government-wide guidance for federal agencies on elevating Indigenous knowledges. In November of 2022, that government-wide guidance was released. This guidance is available online, and it includes an overview of Indigenous knowledge, a list of federal statutes where Indigenous knowledges may be relevant, and promising practices for growing and maintaining relationships to support Indigenous knowledges, such as respecting different processes and worldviews, considering co-management and co-stewardship structures, and pursuing knowledge co-production, as well as guidance for applying Indigenous knowledges. The federal guidance discusses many benefits associated with elevating and including Indigenous knowledges in federal policy. Importantly, the guidance recognizes that Indigenous knowledges are valid in their own right. Indigenous knowledges are rooted in an understanding of a people's existence and interactions within shared worldviews and landscapes that have been developed over multiple generations. Bringing Indigenous knowledges and other scientific approaches together in federal research can lead to a better understanding of the issue under study, because considering multiple lines of evidence increases the breadth and the depth of our understanding. A democratic reason for elevating Indigenous knowledges emphasizes that communities are the best judge of their own interests, and their knowledge should be included in the activities that impact them, including scientific research, policy, and land management decisions, in keeping with democratic ideals. An instrumental reason for elevating Indigenous knowledges stresses that effective, inclusive participation builds legitimacy in the decisions that are made. This leads to increased acceptance of those decisions, and thereby better implementation and outcomes than when matters of public interest are left solely to government experts. So as Aparna's introduction highlighted, Indigenous peoples have been and continue to be the sentinels of climate change, with real-time observations of environmental issues and on-the-ground testing of adaptation and mitigation efforts. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time illustrating the benefits of including Indigenous knowledge with a couple of examples of USGS projects. So the first example is a project led by USGS research geographer Clark Knight, the historical role of fire in the Klamath Mountains, California. And this research concerns the history of forest conditions in Northern California. California forests are threatened by a suite of stressors, particularly catastrophic wildfire. The prospect of increasingly severe and frequent fires provides strong motivation to analyze long-term data sets about forest composition and fire in California, because that information could improve management decisions. For most of the 20th century, fire management policies in the United States focused on suppression and prevention of fires. This has led to overstocked forests that, when they did eventually burn, result in high severity fires and forest mortality. The schematic shown on this slide illustrates the consequences of fire suppression. Clark's research shows that Indigenous land management through the use of fire in California contributed to historic park-like composition of forests that's shown in the pre-fire suppression schematic on the top of this slide. Clark and her team wove Indigenous knowledges from the Karuk tribe with paleo data, focusing on 2 lake sites which, prior to European colonization, supported a population of roughly 2,000 to 3,000. These lakes were gathering locations for acorns and mushrooms, resources for which an open forest composition is critical for optimal growing conditions. Oral histories from the Karuk have shed light on the modern landscape. So, for example, one elder said, "We've never had this much fuel on the ground," highlighting the anomalous modern period. For the paleo data side, they used 2 proxies for fire. First, fire scars revealed infrequent fire between 1700 and 1900 Common Era, and charcoal data revealed increasing fire during the Little Ice Age. This was a period that was wetter and colder than present and would not be expected to have increasing fire, thus providing an additional sign of human influence on the environment. Lastly, Clark's team used pollen to reconstruct vegetation and found that the 20th century had the highest levels of fire-tolerant species in 3,000 years, again putting the modern period into a longer-term historical context. The main findings from Clark's study suggest that Indigenous stewardship contributed substantially to the historic fire regime, and the historic forest composition record suggests frequent fire limited forest growth. Predictions from each of the independent lines of evidence, the Indigenous knowledge, fire proxies, and pollen are all in agreement. Given these findings, contemporary forest composition is unprecedented, and Indigenous forest and fire management was critical to maintaining forest conditions prior to colonization. This study showed that integrating paleo data and Indigenous knowledge can be a powerful way of understanding the ecology of the past. The next example is from a project that I was involved in called the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta Berry Outlook. This study was interested in the ecology of berry resources in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta region of Western Alaska. Berries are important to both human and wildlife communities in this region, and both may be affected by decreased abundance in berries. We currently lack the necessary tools and data to predict how the distribution and productivity of berries may change due to climate-induced landscape change. To investigate this, we first gained permission from each of the tribal councils in the villages of Chivak, Kotlik, Amonik, and Hooper Bay, and then worked with our colleagues in the Chivak and Kotlik tribal councils to develop a cultural consensus survey. Cultural consensus surveys are a specific type of survey that can help identify cultural knowledge on a topic. The survey provides statements for the survey respondent to agree or disagree with. For example, in our case, statements like, if there is a small amount of snow in the winter, there will be fewer berries in the summer. The respondent then has the option of agreeing with that statement, disagreeing with that statement, or stating that they are unsure. So we read the same statements to respondents for salmonberries, crowberries, and blueberries. And shown here are the percentage of respondents who agreed that the following potential drivers of berry productivity had a negative impact on those berries. We found that there are some regional differences in things like all-terrain vehicles, which impacted berries in Chivak and Hooper Bay, but not in Amonik or Kotlik. And there was less agreement overall on the impacts of some potential drivers. Where we found high levels of agreement across all 4 villages and all 3 berry species was hot summer temperatures and low winter snowpack negatively affecting berry productivity. So we can then establish an observational link that with less snowpack and hot temperatures in the summer, berry productivity will be negatively impacted, which then allows us to predict future berry productivity in this region based on climate models. So you can see here that both the average winter and summer air temperatures are expected to increase over the historic averages in this region, and snowfall is also expected to increase. While it's not shown here, recent research suggests that more precipitation is expected to fall as rain, and rain on snow events are expected to continue increasing in this region, both of which will decrease snowpack and negatively affect berries. So to conclude, across the federal government and at the U.S. Geological Survey, there's a recognition of the need to elevate Indigenous knowledges in our science and decision-making activities. Weaving Indigenous knowledges with data collected using other scientific approaches based on Western world views, such as paleo data and climate models, as shown in the examples here, can broaden our understanding and provide information for mitigating and adapting to climate change by providing new insights into the past, filling gaps in our understanding of ecology, and providing new perspectives on the relationships between people and the landscapes they inhabit. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sherry.
Okay, thank you to Aparna and Nicole for giving me a great introduction. I'm going to talk briefly about an example of how USGS might also incorporate tribal nations as leaders in climate change, as well as engaging Indigenous peoples and perspectives in a study. I am an ecologist, as stated before, and I'm going to talk tonight about the St. Mary and Milk Rivers study. Next slide, please. So I'll give you a little bit of background, the history of the St. Mary and Milk Rivers. This watershed occurs. It's a transboundary watershed that occurs up on between Montana and Alberta, between the U.S. and Canada. In the late 1800s, there were quite a few settlers moving into this area and started farming, which pulled lots of water resources on the Milk River. And during that time, there started to be disputes about the water in the milk later in the year. 6 out of every 10 years, that Milk River ran dry during this time when people were trying to start and get farming going. So by the early 1900s, both the U.S. and Canada were starting to negotiate on how they might share water in this basin between the two countries, which led to the Boundary Waters Treaty and actually the formation of the International Joint Commission. Next slide, please. So before jumping into the International Joint Commission and some of the history and study of this basin, I just wanted to provide a map for you of all of the Indigenous nations that have traditional ties going back millennial to this watershed. And so there are 8 First and Métis nations in Canada, and there are 6 tribal nations that have ties and or reserves on in this watershed. Next slide, please. So the International Joint Commission is a treaty organization. As I said, it was started with the Boundary Waters Treaty in 1909, and it provides a framework for the governments of Canada and US to work on disputes that occur in transboundary waters. The International Joint Commission is also put together by both governments to help just meet the needs of the treaties, and in this particular case, the Boundary Waters Treaty. It's an independent objective advisor and also can help governments kind of stay aware or be aware of emerging issues along any transboundary waters that may occur. Next slide, please. So in the case of the St. Mary and Milk Rivers, there are 2 kind of formal ways that the International Joint Commission works. One on the administrative procedures of apportioning water, and then an infrastructure which actually helps apportion the water. So the Boundary Waters Treaty that was signed in 1909 just basically states that the water should be shared or apportioned between the 2 countries in some way that's beneficial to both. In that treaty, they stated that there should be an accredited officer in the US and an accredited officer in Canada to help carry out the treaty. And in our case, the current accredited officer is our science director at the Wyoming-Montana Water Science Center, John Kilpatrick. But it's really important. Their jobs are important all year long, but they also A lot of that apportionment or administrative procedures takes place during the irrigation seasons between April and October. And then in 1921, they set up some more detailed instructions on exactly how that water needed to be measured and how it's reported out, so people understand how water is being shared. The infrastructure piece is that back in the early 1900s, they actually built a canal on Blackfeet land to divert water out of the St. Mary into the North Fork of the Milk, so that flow would continue into the Milk later on into the summer seasons. So that infrastructure is over 100 years old. And there are also several storage dams and reservoirs that have been built to help move that water. And so as you can see, these are the two kind of focused questions or areas that the study I'm going to talk about is focused on. Next slide, please. So the study that was stood up in 2021 was focused on the administrative procedures, the sharing of water, how can that be made more effective, and the infrastructure, are there opportunities to make improvements? However, the special lenses in particular right now are these factors that affect water in this basin. So that includes climate change, some of the socioeconomic factors involved in this water, aquatic ecosystem health, and then Indigenous nations and their traditional and current connections to the water, as well as recreational use of the water in the basin. Next slide, please. So the directive from the study that was stood up in 2021 is that the study should involve Indigenous peoples and perspectives in its work to the fullest extent possible. And one of the ways in doing that was establishing an Indigenous advisory group to include members from Indigenous nations across the basin from those groups that I showed you in the map previously. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk in a little bit of detail on how we are doing that. And we're obviously in the second, third year of this study, and so the process is ongoing. But one of the very first things we did is set out to talk with people. So we set up virtual and in-person meetings with tribal councils, First Nation chiefs and councils, and Métis Nation regional governments, including Indigenous water managers, to discuss what the focus of the study was and wasn't. That gave us a chance to engage and build relationships, and then also sit and listen and learn about the Indigenous people in this basin, so that we could help target areas of the study that would be of specific interest to these nations, Indigenous nations in the basin. Where we could, we connected with tribal colleges and universities that have active water and ecosystems research, but also to learn about their protocols and guidelines for data sovereignty. Because we're working in water research, we want to make sure we're following guidelines with regard to doing work in their nation. And then the study thought it was really important that that everyone involved in the study went through some training. So First Nations data principles and ownership, control, access, and possession, which is OCAP, and which is a training offered in Canada, was provided for everyone involved in the study. Next slide, please. So that part of the study is kind of highlighted here at the top of the iceberg. Engagement. We're using multiple methods of ways to engage with Indigenous nations, in-person, virtual meetings, SharePoint sites where we can share information from the study, in-person tours of the basin. We're also, as we go out and talk with representatives from these nations, asking them to get involved in all areas of the study. And I'll show you what that looks like here in the next slide. But what I would also tell you probably is key to all of this, making all of this work, is all the work that goes on kind of behind the scenes in the study board. And that's developing a knowledge of where and what these Indigenous nations are interested in the study. You can imagine in a relatively large transboundary water system, nations on the east side of the basin have very different interests in water than perhaps on the west side. And so learning what areas they're interested in and trying to tailor parts of the study that they might be interested in is a really important component of the work we're doing. Aparna talked about how a lot of different tribal nations have climate adaptation plans in place. And so where those are available and appropriate, we have included those in the technical work of the study. We're currently going out right now. The water apportionment part of the technical working group has started to develop some preliminary models, and we're going out and talking with people about how, when, where water is important in the basin to them. And we're taking that information and including it in performance indicators as part of the water modeling that's going on in the study. And then I would also tell you the last part as we move through the study and outputs are being produced and data is being synthesized, we're working hard to make sure that data is available and usable for all of the Indigenous nations in the basin. And if we can work together on using that data as part of their climate planning, that's our goal. Next slide, please. So it just shows you the structure of the study. In the center, they're kind of the governance framework. In the center is a study board made up of members from both the US and Canada. You can see there's a government forum that actually helps inform the study board and has voting rights on things brought to them. There's advisory groups, as I talked about before, an Indigenous advisory group, a public advisory group, and then what I kind of call over on the left-hand side, the technical teams. This is the wheels or the gears of the study. These are the groups that are investigating different studies and putting together data that might help inform apportionment or infrastructure outputs from the study. I've put on here stars where we've been able to invite and include Indigenous members from the basin into the study. So for example, in the government forum, there are several tribal water resource managers, tribal and First Nation water resource managers. In the Indigenous Advisory Group, we have elders from these nations, and we also have tribal historic preservation officers, as well as some tribal and First Nation council members. Over in the technical teams, we've got tribal fisheries biologists, we have tribal climate change coordinators, as well as other hydrologists from the basin, all working in their own tribal nations, but bringing their expertise and input to the technical work of the study. Next slide, please. So my last slide here just shows you our timeline. The study is ongoing and really is in what I call the meaty part of the study. We will submit a report in June 2025, and then those recommendations will be put together by the International Joint Commission and forwarded to the governments of the US and Canada. And so with that, I think that's my last slide. You can go to the next slide, and I think I'll turn it back over to Aparna to just kind of wrap us up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nicole and Sherry, for sharing what you've been working on with your USGS colleagues. And so I just wanted to really quickly summarize some of our key takeaways that I hope you learned during our talk today. We hope that we communicated to you that Indigenous communities are some of the communities that are really on the front line of the impacts of climate change, that there are many Indigenous communities that are leading the way for the United States on climate adaptation, that we are able to improve the quality of USGS science by including Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous partners in our projects, and that we are working very hard to tailor USGS science for tribal resource management needs. Next slide. We also wanted to share some additional resources in case you enjoyed the content of this talk and would like to learn more. The first is that the USGS National Climate Adaptation Science Center recently did a webinar series on Indigenous Knowledges, and so the recordings of those webinars are available for you to watch. There's also a status of tribes and climate change report that was released in 2021, and it has sectoral breakdowns of the impacts of climate change on tribes and a variety of other topics. That is a report that will be updated, and they're in the process of putting together author teams for that revision. There's also a national climate assessment that periodically is released for the entire United States. The fourth National Climate Assessment came out in 2018, and that volume had a chapter specifically on tribes and Indigenous peoples. The fifth National Climate Assessment will be released later this year, hopefully sometime in mid-December, early to mid-December, and again, we'll have another chapter on tribes and Indigenous peoples that will provide an update to the previously released National Climate Assessment. And lastly, as Nicole mentioned, the White House released guidance for federal departments and agencies on Indigenous knowledge and how we can better include Indigenous knowledges in the work that we're doing. All of these are also on the same website for this virtual public lecture, so you can access them there, and I do believe that Mitch might be dropping them in the chat for you as well. And then we, of course, as USGS scientists, are a resource for you, the public, and we are happy to try to help you if you have further questions. Next slide. And again, I just want to thank you on behalf of myself, Nicole, and Sherry for taking the time to watch this presentation. We really appreciate your interest and enthusiasm. And with this, I think we have a moderator to help us with the Q&A.
Yes, we do. Thank you again, ladies. It was a wonderful talk tonight. We do have some questions. Bunch of good questions have come in. If you would still like to submit a question, please go ahead and submit your questions in the Q&A box. But let's start. Pretty in detailed questions, so this might take a little bit of time. Okay. First question from Nate. Are there specific considerations tribes make for protecting, promoting biodiversity and conservation in their adaptation planning?
Yeah, thank you for that great question. I'm going to take a first attempt at answering questions, and hopefully Nicole and Sherry can step in as they want to contribute expertise. So I think, as we mentioned, there are a lot of federally recognized tribes and then non-federally recognized Indigenous communities across the US, and they all have their own unique contexts and backgrounds and traditions. So I'm going to try to give an answer, but I don't want it to be seen as a monolithic answer that applies to every one of those tribes and communities. There are a lot of tribes that are doing climate adaptation planning. It is often a comprehensive, cohesive adaptation plan that touches on every department across the tribal government. So not just natural resource management or fish and wildlife management, but thinking about how those intersect with water or housing or human health. And so biodiversity and conservation are components of that entire holistic view of how these systems work together. And so, yes, many tribes are considering biodiversity and conservation in their adaptation planning. They may be doing that for species of conservation concern for the United States, for example, threatened or endangered species, and they may be doing it for species that are culturally important to them, for example, foods that are very important, or medicinal plants, or plants or animals that are used in ceremonies And so I think there are a number of tribes that are doing this kind of planning. And Nicole or Sherry, do either of you want to add anything to that? No, I'm seeing shaking heads no, so.
Okay, next question. Have you found any resistance from Indigenous communities on sharing their customs and practices? Do they come to you, or are you going to them?
I think, you know, this can work both ways. Sometimes USGS comes to a community and builds relationships and says, this is maybe, what do you need? How can we help support the things that you're doing? And sometimes communities come to us saying, we really need help and support to accomplish this goal or objective of ours. Particularly with federally recognized tribes, because they are sovereign nations, we follow their lead on information sharing and use. We work, for example, with tribal government, whether that's a council or a chief or whatever other political structure that tribe has, to ensure that we have the correct protocols in place to honor what they're willing to share with us, what they're willing to have studied. Sometimes, we are providing a method or a technique and the tribe will take it and apply it internally because they aren't comfortable sharing their own information and knowledge with us. So we really do try to follow their lead. And I'm going to turn it over to Nicole because I know Nicole has done some work trying to establish ethical guidelines and protocols for how to do this.
Yeah, thank you, Aparna. I think that what can be really important for us to remember when we're working with Indigenous communities is to ensure that they have free, prior, and informed consent whenever we're requesting them to share any of their Indigenous knowledge or any of their cultural customs with us, and that we're being really honest and transparent about our ability to protect or our inability to protect any information that's shared with us. And so, as Aparna mentioned, really following the lead of the community and what and how they would like to work with us and what kinds of things they would like to contribute, and identifying places where maybe we should be more hands off and just support the community in their own science to implement some of these practices. But yeah, that's a really good question, and I think that it's something that USGS scientists and any scientists working with tribal communities need to keep in mind, that they're individuals that have the right to say no to participation, and they're also often sovereign nations, and we need to honor and respect their decisions whether they would like to work with us or not. Thank you.
Okay, next question. This is a fascinating topic. What other agencies do you work with? For the fire example, did you work with the Forest Service and other local agencies?
Yeah, thank you again for another great question. And yes, we work very closely with other U.S. federal agencies. Forest Service is an example from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We also often work with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And in fact, they have their own tribal climate resilience program that works directly with tribal nations on their climate change related needs. And so we try to work with all of our partners very closely to ensure that we are complementing each other's work and that we aren't stepping on each other's toes and that we're not duplicating effort. And I think, the example that Sherry gave is a project that really demonstrates the coordination that happens not just with other agencies, but with other governments. And so, Sherry, I don't know if you would like to add a little bit in response to this question.
Sure, I'll just add a little part that in the study that I talked about, it's really a hugely big multi-agency, multi-country, multi-nation effort. And so, yeah, we are crossing, there's several federal agencies involved, there's state agencies, there's province groups, there's federal groups from both US and Canada. So I mean, I think it probably depends. It's a local study and a local problem, but you know, water apportionment or water sharing is a global issue, and so we've got a lot of people involved who are very interested in making sure everyone who can get water gets water. And so, yeah, it is, as well as local, I would say there's also local regional irrigation groups, farming groups involved in our study. So I think it to some degree, it's anyone who's interested in this issue is involved in our study. And we're not really limited by what groups you belong to, because it's an issue for the whole area.
Okay, next question. Person says, I'm sorry, you may have gone over this, but I came on late. What do you define as an Indigenous community?
Yeah, so very, very generally, Indigenous peoples are the people who inhabited the Western Hemisphere prior to the arrival of European settlers in the 15th century. But more specifically, you know, you hear us using this term federally recognized tribe. Those are tribes that have a government-to-government relationship with the United States. They have a special designation. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. 228 of those are located in Alaska. But in addition to those federally recognized tribes, there are other Indigenous communities. There are some state recognized tribes, and then there are, for example, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities as well. So there are a number of Indigenous communities in addition to those federally recognized tribes.
Okay, next question from Wendy. Yosemite National Park now has a cultural ecologist who, among other things, is sharing Indigenous knowledge about wildfire control. Might USGS provide assistance in other parks that don't have their own Indigenous ecologists?
Yeah, thank you. So there are a number of projects across USGS that are occurring in partnership with the National Park Service to help kind of integrate Indigenous knowledges with traditional park management practices that are based more in Western science. And so that is happening. It's probably not happening in every park, which might be what we would hope for someday, but yes, it's definitely happening.
Okay. Is there a concerted effort in government agencies to engage in genuine co-management of lands, or is there resistance from major land management agencies?
Yeah, so I think that the guidance that has been released really encourages, you know, these conversations about how to develop shared goals and objectives for management of land that may have been the traditional homelands of a Indigenous community. Maybe they were displaced and now it's a national park. And they have, for example, sacred burial sites or other culturally important sites within those park boundaries. So I think there is a lot of good intent, but there is also a very complicated legal and policy landscape that can sometimes govern what is possible, the strength of those commitments. Sometimes, you know, parks are mandated to manage to certain resource standards, and so it can vary quite a bit from one land management unit to the next. But yes, I think there is generally a very strong interest in having these conversations. And Nicole and Sherry, I don't know if either of you have anything to add.
So I'll just add that there was a recent, I don't remember exactly the year that it came out, but there was a recent a joint secretarial order from the Department of Interior, which the Park Service is part of, and USDA, which is Forest Service, for co-stewardship. So there is a push to increase co-stewardship arrangements in the land management agencies within the Department of Interior and USDA, which is primarily the Forest Service. So I think that there is a push for that, but as Aparna mentioned, it's a complicated process that's going to take time to do. Thanks.
Okay, this is kind of a long question, but could you say more about the extent of indigenous cultural burning across what is now the U.S. before settlers began to suppress wildfires and cultural burning? For example, how much was burned, how often? Although I realize it must have been different in different ecosystems and landscape. Was most of the burning close to settlements?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And I think, as you know, it must have varied widely depending on the landscape and location. And I will admit this is not my area of research, so in a minute I will ask Nicole if she has anything to add. What I'll also say is that it can be a challenge to have some of these conversations about traditional practices because of the legacy of educational removal of Native youth from their communities. So many Native youth were taken from their communities and placed in boarding schools. And sometimes there is a disconnect in the transition of knowledge from one generation to the next. And so I do think there are some limitations to what we know about how cultural burning practices were applied, because some of that history has been lost due to some of the policies that the United States carried out. But as Nicole mentioned, there are projects that are doing these interviews to try to determine what is known, and also to look at the scientific paleo record to reconstruct what might still be out there on the landscape. And Nicole, I'll turn it to you to see if you have more you want to add.
Sure. So the research study on the cultural burning that I referenced was not my own work, and so I can't speak to it in detail, but I can say that I think that my understanding is historic fire practices like this varied pretty broadly across the United States, and so there was some widespread use of it, I think, in the Western United States and California, but it was also a strategy in the East, the eastern part of the country. And so really the strategies, the fire management strategies, were a result of kind of how folks were wanting to manage the land, right? So in the example that I provided, they wanted an open forest, presumably to increase the species that they wanted to harvest for acorns and mushrooms. And so as a similar answer that Aparna gave earlier, it's really hard to generalize across the country what kinds of practices Indigenous peoples had, and there is this gap in our understanding for all of the reasons that Aparna mentioned. But there's a lot of information about cultural burning online, and there are some other USGS resources about that. So I'd encourage, some Google searches about it could probably get you pretty far to understanding.
Okay, next question. Will the slides of the presentation be shared? There's been so much wonderful information presented. Thank you for the informative, exciting presentation.
I'm happy to share the slides from this. I do know that, Mitch, there's going to be a recording available, and I don't know if the slides can be posted. We can share them for them to be posted.
Yeah, the recording will be available on the public lecture website and our YouTube public lecture channel in about a week to 10 days. Okay, more of a comment than a question is, thank you for an excellent presentation. Fascinating and so good to know this is happening. Couple more questions here. How much do the current indigenous communities connect with the knowledge from 300 to 1,000 years ago? How much does it vary among tribes?
Yes, this is a great question, and I think it varies quite a lot amongst tribes. And it depends, like I mentioned, how much they were impacted by the removal, whether people moved back to those communities, whether that intergenerational transfer of knowledge occurred. There are some communities in the United States that are Orthodox communities that hold very closely to their traditional cultural worldviews and their practices. And then there are some communities that are much more modernized, and it ranges from communities that are highly urbanized to communities that are rural, that may not have access to electricity and running water. So it's a pretty broad spectrum. And Sherry, I know you've worked with a number of tribes in the basin that you presented on. Would you like to add anything to that reply?
Sure, I'll just add maybe a couple of things. Some of the people I work with in the basin are tribal historic preservation officers. So some of the tribes in the U.S. Have a department, and their main goal is historic preservation of their cultures, their lands, their languages, everything about that. And so I would tell you, just as Aparna stated, some tribes are very, very active with preservation and connection to their culture for thousands of years. But it just depends on where that tribe is focused. In fact, one of the tribes I work with, the Fort Peck tribes, is really active in historic preservation, but they're actually not located, their reservation is not located on their traditional homelands. So you can imagine that there's probably a little bit of work that has to be done when your reserved lands are not where your traditional connections are. So, but yes, I think most tribes are probably pretty active in the knowledge, and it also is present in people as well, as Aparna stated.
Okay. Has USGS encountered situations where tribes are interested but do not have the capacity to consult? What sort of capacity buildings does USGS assist with in these cases, if any? Does USGS work differently with federally recognized versus unrecognized tribes?
Yeah, thanks for this question. So yes, tribal capacity to work on climate issues varies widely. Not every tribe, for example, has an environmental department within their government. Not every tribe that has an environmental department has more than one staff member in that environmental department. And then there are some tribes that have their own environmental or water departments and manage, for example, large amounts of resources in very complex ways. So it varies quite a bit. For tribes that have interest in climate impacts and adaptation, but that don't necessarily have a lot of capacity, USGS can work with those tribes to understand what their interests are, what kind of information might be the most useful to them. It might just be, for example, understanding, what is it about climate change that I should be concerned about? What is my exposure to this hazard? It could be, what are the impacts of climate change to a very specific resource that's very, very important to my tribe? Or it could be, I want to start working on a climate adaptation plan, but I need help having conversations with all of the different departments, that I need help presenting the science to them about what climate change means. So we can work with tribes in all of these capacities. There Like I said, the Bureau of Indian Affairs also has a tribal climate resilience program, and they do quite a bit of work with tribal governments to help them as well. They also have a grant funding program. So if tribes are interested in climate planning or climate adaptation, they can apply for those funds to help support their capacity. And in terms of working differently with federally recognized versus unrecognized tribes, I'm not aware of any differences in how we work with them. I think if partners need science and they are working on natural resource management issues, we try to support them with the best available science that we can. Nicole or Sherry, do you want to add anything to that? No, sounds like they're good with that answer.
Yeah. And the last question we have is a comment. Fabulous presentation and excellent answering of questions too. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
And I would also like to thank you all for the talk tonight, and thanks all the people out there who joined us tonight as well. This lecture will be available for on-demand viewing in about a week on our website at www.usgs.gov/PLS. You can also see many of our previous recordings on the website under the multimedia section for videos. We have public lectures that have been recorded for close to 30 years now. If you would like to subscribe to be part of our monthly mailing list, please feel free to send us an email at wmcesic@usgs.gov, and we will happily add you to the list. Again, we hope you join us again next month for our public lecture on Thursday, September 28th at 6 p.m. Pacific time, when Ole Caven of the USGS Earthquake Science Center will give us talk about geothermal energy within the USGS. Goldilocks to electricity with earthquakes in between. Hope to see you then. Goodbye.